So this is where we left off on the drone. This is our drone, the DJI Phantom 2, I believe. So let's start tackling this cylinder, this kind of guy that sits underneath the propeller and on the ends of each rotor. As you'll see that we still have two active symmetry objects. These have not been made editable, so I'm going to deactivate these one at a time. That way we are just working with our one quadrant of our drone. This keeps our workflow as efficient as possible, and this means that I really only need to make each of these motor propeller things one time and not 4 times. So let's start. So the first thing that I notice on mine is that this little piece here, which is really where this motor, I believe this is the motor. I'm no drone scientist, so I'm just going to call it the motor, and I'm going to make a cylinder and place it right there by just holding down shift when I make this cylinder. That way it is appropriately inserted into my hierarchy. And then
I'm sorry, that'll automatically go in there if you hold shift?
Yeah, so when you hold down Alt and make something, it'll make it as a parent, and if you hold down shift, it'll make something as a child. So snapping is on, our little magnet down here, and I'm going to move this up over here and get it centered to where it needs to be. And then just kind of scale this down a little bit. That looks pretty close, so obviously it's going to be way too tall. Way too tall, because when I look on my underneath or side picture, you can see that this motor does not extend down, it does not come down this way. So I know that all of this stuff has to be above where my arm is. Relatively basic detail, but not something that we want to overlook. So I'm going to lower the segments down to 8 just for the time being. It's nice to stay as simple as possible when you're at the early stages of a project like this. So then I will name this Propeller Motor, and make it editable. And because it was a cylinder, the first thing I want to do is now optimize it. So that way, if I want to extrude or move these polygons or anything, they behave this way and not this way. Because this.
One more time, how do you optimize?
UO. This would be bad, so we don't want that. Alright, so that's optimized and in place, and I think it's roughly about as tall as it needs to be. So one thing that I can notice is that it's got there are these like kind of yellow coils that are visible. It's almost like there's kind of a hole in the inside of this thing itself. So I'm going to try to replicate some of that detail. So I'm going to select this part up here and do an inwards extrude. The super shortcut for inwards extrude is I. Or you can go M and then find it in here somewhere. But I just use I. And then I want to extrude this part down now, because basically right now I'm making is this white piece of plastic, this outer portion of plastic. Well, in this picture it's more kind of like a gray, but we can see there's like some yellow somethings in there. So we're going to try to make the space for those yellow somethings. So we're going to extrude downwards, and we're going to make ourselves like this little cavity. I'm going to pretend that this is like some sort of battery or like, I don't know, something in here. So, to make those little coil things, these look like, I've seen other photographs, and it looks almost like, I'm going to draw a really crappy drawing in paint. It's going to be really crappy. So to make it slightly less crappy, I'm going to try to use the circle tool. So if we're looking at this from above, right here is the piece of plastic that we've got, and then there's going to be another circle in the middle. So this is what like the propeller is going to sit on. So here's my super great diagram of the propeller. So all this is the propeller, and I can't remember how to zoom out. That's too far. Okay. Anyway, so now with these yellow things, we're just gonna use the pencil tool maybe. Nope. Man, paint is something else.
These triangles. You'd have to rotate them now.
There we go. This is what we want. So we're gonna try to make these yellow coil battery whatever things, and they're kind of like arranged in a line, sort of like this. And they kind of go all the way around. So you guys, I think you guys get the point of what I'm trying to lay out here. So they go, yeah, it's kind of like a really crappy sun. This is probably the quality illustration you'd find on like your thermostat or something at home, and not something that somebody who calls themselves an artist would make. So let's make something that sort of approximates those little yellow coil things. So I'm going to start with like a really tiny cube, and I'm going to again hold shift to make sure that it's grouped properly, and then move it and snap it up there, and we're going to make one of these really small, smaller than that even. Cool, super tall. So something like that, maybe. It'll kind of just get the point across. Turn off snapping and sort of move it, or just scale it a little bit more. Alright, cool, that's going to be good enough. I don't know what else to call this, so I'm just going to call it coil. And then to make this kind of array where they're going to be fanned out in a ring, we're going to use a cloner, which can be found up under MoGraph, and then the word cloner. So this one is when we want to hold down Alt when we create this. So I'm going to hold down Alt and let go of my mouse, and it will create this. And we can see here, it's very important that this is parented in this exact way. And so we can see that this cloner just by default is on a linear mode, right here, linear mode, and it's just making them shoot up in a straight line. But we can change that from linear to radial, and that's in a circle. It's not the right kind of circle, but we can change this plane setting to figure out which way that we want to orient these, and that's the way. And then we just want to bring this radius down, so I'm just going to grab this orange little handlebar, and now we just made the pentagon, but not our sad sun. So what we want to do is we want to go to the Transform tab, and it's important to use the Transform tab in this specific case, not the Coordinates tab. So in the Transform tab, we can play around. Basically what we need to do is we need to rotate the orientation of these clones. All these little cubes that this cloner is making are rotated in just whatever the default setting is. So we want to rotate them in some way, and it looks like 90 degrees in H. This one right here looks like this is the ticket. So this got me the shape that I want, but now I just need to go back to Object and just make more, so I can raise up my count value. And I don't want to go too crazy high, so maybe like 12. I think 12 will be a good enough number. That looks pretty good. This leaves me a circle kind of hole in the middle to have my little propeller kind of come out. So I can just move these down into here a little. I'm actually going to go back to the little cube I made and make them just a little bit taller, just so that they fill up this space a little bit more. I don't know how accurate that is to this exact drone, but it looks a little bit better with them being longer. And just for fun, I can change the color here to like a yellowish color. This isn't going to affect the way that they render. We're going to do the materials and stuff down the road, but just for fun, we're going to make these yellow to match our reference. Cool, so that's a thing. So we're going to just call this coils cloner, and we can just leave that, sort of forget about it for now. So now it's time to start on the propeller, which will be today's fun task. So we can see that this starts with a kind of cylinder, almost sort of dome. I'm not going to worry about that just yet. It would be fun to, but I think that I'm just going to start out a little bit more simply, and I'm going to start that with a cube. So I'm going to come back up to my top camera, and I don't want to make my next cube, or my propeller cube, I don't want it to be involved with the cloner, so I'm going to select up one in my hierarchy up to the propeller motor, and then make my cube, again holding down shift so that it becomes parented correctly, and then re-enable snapping and move this back over, get it to snap correctly in the center. There we go. So just for fun, real quick, I'm going to rotate this kind of to match my picture, just so that I can get an approximate of how long I need this to be. That looks pretty close. So with this cube, we are going to add in a couple divisions along one of the axes. I'm just going to solo this cube momentarily, just so that I get everything else out of my way. And I want to add in a couple divisions on X, I think. I think that'll be good enough for now. And because a propeller like this, well, actually I'm not sure if they are symmetrical from one side to the other. They look symmetrical enough to me, whereas somebody who isn't a propeller expert wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I'm going to only model half of this, and we're going to use our friend Symmetry to make both halves of the propeller, because this is like a pretty complicated shape. There's a lot of tweaking and editing that goes into making a shape like this, and you know, why do that work twice if you can get by with only doing it once? So I will then, in order to set up Symmetry, I want to make my cube editable with our C hotkey, and then I want to delete half of this. So I'm going to go to my selection tool and turn off only select visible elements, and I'm going to delete one half of this. So I'm selecting all the edges on one side, and I can just hit delete. So this will leave me with from the center point onwards out along one blade. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to save and then just version my file because today's the second day that I'm working on it. So I'm going to do a version 2. It can be pretty useful to version your files either by day or a few times an hour or whatever, just in case a file corrupts. If you did all this work on one project file, all of it's all done on version 1. If that file just somehow corrupts, because sometimes computers are computers, then unfortunately you would lose a lot of work. Whereas if you increment your files, you might only lose a day's worth of work or only a few hours or minutes, depending on how often you save. So let's start shaping this. The basic shape is a little tall, like usual. Seems like I make cubes and forget to adjust how high they are or how tall they are. So that's a little low and thin. So this is like a little bit more appropriate now. Actually, it still might be a little bit too thick. It's a little bit better. Cool. Jump back to my top camera and re-enable solo on this. So I'm going to start just moving some of these points around to mimic the shape of this propeller blade. And you'll notice that I'm not adding any divisions currently. I'm just working with the small handful that I made just at the initial stage of making it a cube. It can be a little bit tough to figure out kind of where this image ends and where it begins, because the white background here, part of this blade is going to be reflecting the kind of white environment that it was photographed on. So that can always be a fun kind of guessing game of where does this pixel end, I like to call it. So down here on the end, I'm actually going to move inside of where what you would think the center of the propeller is, because we're just going to use like a sphere or something like easy for the center. But I still want to preserve kind of the line work that's sort of making the form of this right here. And don't worry about this curve too much. I can just kind of pull this into place. It's going to be not that accurate initially. This looks more like an aircraft wing than a propeller because it is not curved. One of the key defining features of a propeller like this is the fact that it twists. It has a bit of an arc to it. Let's see if I can get a good idea for how what the shape is. This is sort of giving me an idea. Now part of the kind of secret magic behind a propeller is the fact that it is both twisting and it's kind of tilted. So it's a little bit of both. It's not curved too much, but there's a little bit of curve to it, I think. So to get that curve, what we have to do is we need to add a knife cut kind of down the middle of our propeller. That'll be one of the more important parts of this. So we can grab our knife tool and set it to loop. And I want to make a cut directly down the middle at 50% mark. So I'm going to do the fun little trick where you tap the shift key and this line turns dark gray, which allows you to type in the number 50 and hit enter, and then you see this line jumps.
How did you make that dark gray?
So if you just have the tool and you're just hanging out with the knife tool, see it's like bright white.
Right.
If you tap the shift key, just don't hold it or press it, or just give it one little tap. It'll turn a darker color gray. I'm not sure how much you can see that on the projector, but it'll become apparent when you're doing it for yourselves. And then you see how on my mouse it's no longer following, the tool is no longer following my mouse. So you know that it worked, and you can type in the number 50, and when I do this, watch this line. I typed in 50, and when I hit enter, you'll see that that line moved. And it moved to the 50% point, and so now I can just click and I can make a nice perfect 50% cut. And that is important when you're doing a shape like this, because we are going to eventually be using the subdivision surface, which some of us used on our bottles and our product renderings to kind of varying amounts of success. But we want to have more success this time around. So we're going to kind of go into a little bit more about the why. Why is the subdivision surface such a cryptic object that is hard to unravel its mysteries? We're going to learn a little bit about that eventually. But it's important to have nicely made, even cuts like this. We don't want like crazy knife cuts that are like all over the place, where stuff is just like all over who knows what, where. We don't want any of that. We want just like nice, clean rectangles. These are called quads because each of these polygons has 4 sides. So I'm going to shut up, and we're just going to model the rest of this. It's enough lecturing about that topic. So we can see that we are actually a little bit, there's a little bit of like work that we need to do in terms of like kind of leveling this out. It's a little bit too high actually. Now, this image isn't the greatest image because there's a little bit of perspective. The fact that you can see that the front arm is actually higher up than the rear arm. It's going to kind of make this a little bit more of a challenge for me to line this up. And I know that it doesn't look like the length of this propeller is right, but that's because it's rotated. Whereas like if I rotated it out that way, now see it'll match that image. But I don't really want to pay attention to the side image. I'm going to use my top image for more of this. So to start replicating the fact that this is twisting, what I want to do is I can make my little mouse cursor larger or smaller, like this, to make selecting stuff easier. And to do that, you hold down Control, and you can click and drag with the middle mouse button. So just like left and right. It's kind of like just increasing your brush size in Photoshop, sort of. So I'm going to use that to select a bunch of the propeller points, and I'm going to figure out which way that I need to twist this. It looks like on all the propellers, the side that has this sort of dog leg shape that sticks out, this is the side that points downwards. So that is this side right here. Oops. So I want to grab my rotate tool, and in this case I want to rotate along the red axis, and I want to go this way because I want to start to make this propeller shaped so this this side is angling down. And what I'm going to do to replicate the fact that this is twisting a bit, this side, or this portion of the propeller is more twisted than over here. This is almost sort of like even. It's on an angle, but it's more flat than this is leading on. So what I'm going to do is then deselect this portion right there, and then rotate these up a little bit now. And do the same thing. Deselect that side, or that set of points. Rotate this a little bit now. And do this one more time here on the edge. And so we can start to see that this has got a little bit of shape. Actually, I do need to rotate these points right here, sort of right along the base. I forgot those. So these ones, we're gonna want to rotate these even more. There we are. So we can see that kind of as a whole, this object is twisting. And it's a lot easier to work on a shape like this when it's very, very simple. This is a very, very simple shape currently. We can name it Propeller because that's what it is. We want to make sure we're staying diligent with our names. I think really the only thing I need to do left is just sort of taper this down. I just need to make it get a little bit thinner, skinnier, as it comes out along the edge. I don't know much about propellers, but I do know that the leading edge, the side that's facing forward, is always a little bit thicker than the trailing edge. That's evident if you look at a picture of an airplane wing. Airplane wing. Here we are. So this is like a good little depiction. Now an airplane arm is not going to be exactly the same as a propeller, but it'll give you an idea where this is sort of the front edge and this is the back edge. So we can see that this side is coming to a point which looks pretty accurate, I'd say, to the way that this is shaped. So this back edge is going to be quite a bit thinner. So we're just going to grab these and shrink these down kind of point by point, I think. So I'm just holding down Shift. I want to make sure that these are at least even with each other. So I'm just going to randomly decide on 30% is how far down I'm going to scale these. So I'm going to grab each of these percentages and scale them down to the word 30%. Actually, I want to in this case, I do want to make sure that I'm setting my Scale Tools modeling axis orientation to normal, because the fact that these are going to be rotated, I want to make sure, like, when it comes time to scale this one, that I'm scaling this one at the appropriate angle, as opposed to if I scale it directly up and down. If I scale it directly up and down, we're going to see that now it's creating this like sort of overhang and it's becoming pointed. I don't want that. So I'm going to set that to normal to avoid that issue. So we're just going to quickly scale these all down to 30%. That's the number that I picked out of a hat. So good, we made that side thinner. Now we're going to want to make the front side thinner as well, but not quite as thin, just so that we can sort of get it to be a little bit more accurate. So I'm going to say maybe like 50% instead of 30%. There we go. So that gives us a little bit of thickness kind of in the middle, which is appropriate and accurate. Although on this edge, I do notice that this is even thinner than I've got. So I will address that and make sure. I'm just going to bring all these down a little bit more, just along the very, very edge out here. Not quite like paper thin, but something pretty dang thin. Alright, that's looking pretty good. So, to make the other half of this propeller, so that I don't have to model it twice. Let's see what happens if we just set up a symmetry object. So if I hold down Alt when I make my symmetry object, it will make this grouped correctly. But we can see that the other half of this propeller is actually flipped around. This is more like a bird instead of a propeller. And so I don't think there's a whole lot that we have to control when it comes to using the symmetry object. Correct. Yeah.
Can't you just copy it?
I could just copy it and paste it, but the trick or the downside of that is eventually I'm going to come through and make this a little bit more accurate. I'm sort of just blocking in. I'm making rough versions of everything right now. This would pretty much be, kind of your first stage of making any complex model. If you were to model something that had as many pieces as this for a real job, you would probably start in a fashion similar to this, especially if you were working in part of a team. Maybe one person makes the rough model of everything, and then let's just say you're working with 5 people. All 5 people then, once there's a rough part, each person takes one section of the drone, and then they all would work on one. They're individually assigned high quality versions of this. Or even if you were just working alone, sort of on something like this as a professional, you would still go about this blocking in stage, where you're keeping stuff kind of rough. You're keeping it as flexible as possible, so that way, if the client comes by and says, "Oh, well, now all of a sudden my drone has 6 propellers, what are you going to do about it?" Well, then you haven't traveled so far down the path of making it have 4 propellers. Now that it's going to be too much work to go back, you just have to start all over. You never want to be caught in that position. If I really wanted to, I could adapt the way that I'm using my symmetry objects, and I could make this drone with a little bit of tweaking have 6 propellers. If the client or my boss or whoever said, now all of a sudden you've got to make this drastic change to your object, I wouldn't be completely up the creek without a paddle, so to speak. So the symmetry object is not going to be our friend in this case, but we can just back this up to before we made the propeller. I've got an idea of using a cloner in a very similar way to how we would use the symmetry object. So I'm going to make my cloner, and holding down Alt on the propeller. So much like how we just used the cloner to make these little coil things, we made 10 or 15 of them in a radial array. I want to figure out, I think that's the way, but I only want 2 propellers. Now these are a little offset from each other, and that is because there's a radius value. So if I make my cloner into a radial cloner and only put 2 of them, it's basically taking one and then spinning the other one around 180 degrees. But the point still stands that if now all of a sudden I need to add, if I need to make some crazy change to the end of this, like let's just say I need to make my propeller blade shaped like that, look, it just did the other side as well. It still retains my ability to edit it because I'm only editing one object right here, and this cloner is taking care of making its partner on the other side. So this is kind of a creative, sort of out-of-the-box way of replicating something that's similar to the symmetry object.
When you made the cloner, you were on Propeller and you hit, did you hold Alt when you made it?
Mhm.
Okay.
So this is just, I'm going to rename this Propeller Cloner.
And what was your orientation? XZ?
XZ, yes. But you can just shuffle between there's only 3 options, and it'll become pretty obvious which one's which. So as far as the blocking in stage, I'm going to say that that's pretty well good for the propeller blade itself. We can make the little centerpiece now. I think by there's a couple options that we've got to make sort of a dome shape. We've got capsule here, and we've got oil tank. Oil tank is kind of just a random as heck primitive that I never get to use, so I'm gonna see if I can put it to use. So I made it. I did not hold down shift when I made it, so it made it sort of at the origin point ungrouped. So I can come back to my top camera and move this and snap it in place. Now it's getting a little hard to see what the heck's going on in here, because this oil tank has got a whole lots of divisions. So we're just going to lower some of these until we start to see something happen. This thing can just kind of take a chill pill. A little big. It's a little tall, as usual. So you could just start with a cylinder and then bevel the sides, or bevel the outer edge. There's a lot of different ways that you could figure out how to make this shape. But I'm just kind of trying to have fun and use this oil tank, which is something that I don't use very often. I typically enjoy using something that I don't use very much. So that looks pretty close. I'm going to call that good enough for a blocking in phase. Although now I am noticing that there are these sort of extrusion points along the top of our little motor. So those shouldn't be too hard to figure out. So with the propeller motor selected, I'm just going to solo it. So we're going to do a couple extrusions here. Basically, we want to grab a couple of our polygons and we're going to go back to our friend MS Paint. It's not called MS Paint anymore, it's called Paint. Look at that. So from our side perspective, we have our oil drum, or sorry, not the oil drum, the propeller thing. So it's kind of a box sort of shape like that. And we've got extrusions that kind of come up, and I'll just draw in a different color. This will be our oil tank, which represents the center of the propeller. So these black parts, this is more or less what we're going to try attempting to model in. So I drew 2 of them. There are going to be 4. So that's why I've got these 4 polygons selected. These are kind of opposing pairs, kind of front, back, side to side. And I think what I want to do is try to extrude, inner extrude a little bit. That way I've got these shapes here, and then I'm going to do a normal extrude and bring these up a little, like that. And then do one more extrude and bring them up a little bit more, like this, And now what I'm going to do is select this one, that one, that one, and that one. And now with these, I'm going to extrude these and bring them together. The little axis point was kind of freaking out a little, but no worries. So I think this is going to be close enough. I should trademark that word. So I think I can delete those faces right there, and then I'm just going to, I know that I want to connect these corner points kind of where I was merging these shapes together, bringing them in towards each other. It would kind of be a pain to merge those, so I'm going to try to optimize this shape and see if that worked. And I think it did. Looks like it did. So now all I've got to do is just close this kind of center hole just in case it becomes visible, and we can easily do that with our friend the so there is bridge, which is under the EMMA modeling menu, but I like to use the polygon pen tool because that has this same functionality, and that what we can do is go from one side to the other and hold down Control and then just left click and go from side to side. And in 2 clicks we closed up that little area. So now if we unsolo, I made them a little too tall, whoopsie. Are they too tall, or is the propeller in the oil tank too low?
I think the propeller in the oil tank.
Yeah, that's sort of a philosophical question.
I think they're too high.
I think they're too high as well. Equal it out, do it in the middle. Because if you lower a little bit, raise it up a little bit.
Alright, so it sounds like we've got some dissenting opinions amongst our class. Maureen came up with a good solution to do a little bit of both. That will hopefully allow us to keep the peace. I don't want an issue where what color is that dress image from the internet. We don't need we don't need that. I agree. I agree that it was white and gold. I know that I'm wrong, but I don't care. So we lowered those, and we're going to raise up the propellers.
Do a little bit of both. There you go.
So the bottom of this oil tank thing is kinda, it's not looking too happy.
There's a point.
Yeah, it's like
Um,
it became a capsule.
Yeah. It basically is the capsule primitive. At this, because of how much I've changed it, I probably should have just left with or started with the capsule primitive, but you know, it's whatever. I just like saying the word oil tank, to be honest. So really all I've got to do to make myself not hate this thing as much is to just make it editable, I think. I'm just making the oil tank editable, and I want to delete, I can use my loop selection to delete these bottom, whatever those things are. Oh, so now it's floating, oh no. But we can just grab that edge there,
Oh, there you go.
and then just probably bring it all the way down to this edge, and use snapping with edge snap on to make sure that I get it perfectly
Now,
even.
don't you like have to have something coming down into the motor to connect it?
Yeah, probably.
It's magic.
There's probably
Oh,
something
okay.
in there, but it's kind of hard to see.
Okay.
The air
Ours are just gonna
from
from.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
My propellers are gonna spin because I'm gonna tell them to spin. They don't need to be
Powered on
accurate
one
enough
piece.
Okay.
to actually spin.
It's magic. Exactly.
So one thing I do want to do while this setup is still kind of simple is to group some of these aspects of this whole getup. I want to group these now before I start moving stuff all over the place and access points start getting all crazy and weird. You're going to save yourself a lot of stress and heartbreak if you group stuff right now. So if you're watching along, think, or your future self is going to thank current you if you group stuff right now. So group stuff. We're going to start with the oil tank because the oil tank is still centered. I know this is like a mess, but I know the fact that I have not moved this. I'm just going to name this Propeller Hub. Instead of the word oil tank. Although I would know, if I saw oil tank in my hierarchy, I would know, like, I know what that is. But Cube 4, who has any idea what Cube 4 could be? So I'm going to group this just Alt-G because I've not moved it from being centered to this propeller kind of area. So now that I've got this group, I can call this propeller group. So with the propeller group null selected, air quotes, I want to put in anything on this that is going to spin when it comes time to animate this. Obviously, I just have JPEG stills. I don't have a video of what this thing looks like when it's spinning, so I can't be 100% certain if this whole metal silver looking part spins along with the propeller or if it stays still and just the propeller spins. I'm going to put my money on it staying still and the propeller just spinning, just because that'll make my life easier.
I also think that like the opposing directions would kind of prove to be about each other.
You mean the fact that they spin
Yeah.
opposite of each other in groups?
Yeah.
We will get to that when it comes time to animate, but I'm glad you bring that up. Keep that in the back of your mind. So I'm just gonna group together what used to be our oil tank and the propeller, not a symmetry thing, and group these together. So this way, I'm not gonna like keyframe this right now, but if I just rotate this, you can see that this is rotating properly, and the base down here where we made our little coil and the thing we were just extruding, this part is not moving, and I can tell that it's also not wobbling, which will be important. Don't do what I'm about to do, but if I set something off kilter, you can see hopefully that center point is going to be, yeah. This is just for demonstration purposes only. Please do not repeat this. Yeah, do not try this at home. You need a permission slip to do this. So you can see that this thing is like wobbling because I didn't know what I was doing and I rotated it the wrong way, and so now my propeller's all jacked up. You don't want a jacked up propeller. It's gonna cause a lot of stress in your life in about 2 weeks when it comes time to finish the rest of this assignment.
Especially if you like symmetry all of the propellers that way. And
Because,
all of them wrong.
right, and that's another even good point is, so let's say I make that mistake right now where I'm still in my blocking in phase, and then I go about and, I make all these symmetry objects and then I make them all editable, and now I've got 4 times the amount of work to fix what was one problem I made, 3 weeks ago. And you don't want that in your life. That is unnecessary stress. So please group stuff properly and appropriately. The propeller motor and this coil thing, these do not need to spin as far as I'm aware, so we can just leave those. But this propeller group is going to become super duper important in a short few weeks time. So I'm just going to save right there, and I'll pause. And we're back. So we've left off, we've got one propeller group all set up, and we've got our symmetry and everything still active. So we've got ourselves a really awesome set of 4 propellers now to go along with the 4 arms of our drone. So let's start addressing the fact that this has no belly. So to do that, I'm just going to turn these symmetry objects back off and jump over to our main drone. So it's going to be a little hard to model, or I'm not going to say hard, but it's trickier than you'd expect to make this this extra little like 90 degree piece right here. But we've got something, our good friend the polygon pen tool, which has unlimited power, can do this for us. So what we basically want to do is we want to rebuild this sort of pie slice shape right here, but down here, so that way there's an underside to our drone. And to do that, you want to just start by you want to just left click your way, starting with the first point, and kind of come out somewhere sort of around here. And then once you've clicked once, you'll start to see this sort of ghosted line, and then you'll have something. It's not very good, but it's something. And so what we can do now is go up to our top camera, and we can use our move tool, but our move tool currently is set to normal orientation, and I'm going to put it back to axis for the time being. Make sure my snapping is on, and that way then I can snap that right there. So now the top and the bottom are going to be aligned, although now this piece is a little bit too low, so I just have to jump into one of my side cameras and snap it there. So that wasn't too bad, wasn't too painful. So now if I re-enable all my symmetry objects, we can see that my drone has a belly, which is good. But one thing that's not good is the fact that you can see there's sort of like a little bit of a glitch here with the way that these polygon faces are appearing. And the reason for that is because we can see all of these are orange when they're selected, which means that they are facing kind of like outwards, which is the way that you want them to. But this one is flipped. It's kind of like inside out. It's almost like this bottom part is inside out. And we can fix that by hitting U. And the command we're looking for is called reverse normals, which is sort of towards the middle of the list, and it's R. And when we hit that, we can see that that now turned orange. So now when we select all, we can see that, and that one's now flipped because I had only select visible elements unchecked, and I made a goof. So I can now flip this one back, and U, R. So now they're all facing outwards, proper. Good. So let's just get started with the legs. I think those will be simple enough for us to tackle in one little session. So this image right here is probably our best bet. Or actually, we can take a trip to the Google to see DJI Phantom 2 drone side. Let's just see real quick on Google Image if we can find a profile, side profile image of this item. Something like exactly like this. So I'm going to view that and then save it to my folder here. This will be right view. I'm not sure if it's the right or the left, but I already had an image that was called side, which may or may not have been inaccurate. Shame on me. So now that I'm in my right viewport, I will hit Shift V to go to my viewport settings, go to back. I'm going to load in my image, right view. Cool. So this image is off-center quite a bit compared to what I've been working off of. So I'm going to use my offsets to just try to align this a little bit. And try to eyeball the propellers, sorta. Alright, so those look pretty centered there and there, and what I was calling the propeller motors look pretty centered. Although this now looks a little bit too tall. So I'm just going to edit this real quick. Shouldn't take too long. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got only select visible elements off. And I can grab all those of the propeller motor, and I'm just going to pull those down a little bit, and then with that I will pull down the propeller group, that's how much we want to bring it down, and then the coils. So those are all a little bit more appropriately in place. Looks like my formerly known as the oil tank is a little bit too small, but I'm not going to sweat that detail. So let's start with this leg thing. Now this is a bit more complicated than I realized, so I'm going to actually simplify it, I think. Because it kind of bows out a bit on the side here, as we see, and it's just there's just like a whole lot more detail to it than I kind of bargained for when I started this. So I think a simple way to set this up will just be with the spline tool or the pen tool. We're going to draw ourselves a spline. Now, so when we were doing the bottle assignment and we were using the lathe, we kind of traced along the outside because we were using the lathe tool. I'm going to use the sweep tool, and when you're using the sweep tool you want to actually trace along the middle of your shape, not along the outsides. So I'm just going to start kind of around here somewhere, sort of use my pen tool ability to follow this down. Whoops. Cool. So I drew half of it, and that's because this part of the leg and this part of the leg would be symmetrical, or at least they look symmetrical enough to where I'm just going to say they are, because this is my drone. I can model it how I want to. So I can just hit escape to get out of the pen tool there, And now to make the other half of it, I'm just going to use symmetry, I think. No, I will not. I need to move my anchor point first. So if we solo this spline, we know that when we want to, I think, oh, never mind, it worked. I just needed to change the symmetry axis. Whoopsie daisy. So let's see if I can get this. We can see there's a gap here in the middle. So I'm going to try to grab that point and hope it connects. There is a checkbox here for called clamp points on axis. I'm not sure how much I trust that, so I'm just going to make this spline editable, and then we've just got our one spline object here. I can get rid of that symmetry, what used to be a symmetry object, and these 2 points right here, I know that I want to optimize these. I know that I want these to be connected, like for sure. And it doesn't look like it has like a Bezier curve to it, which is a little upsetting. So we're going to try right-clicking and making soft interpolation. Yep, so in some weird way I still have like 2 points. They're like overlapping. See, they're not actually like conjoined, which is saddening. So if I select the 2, let's see if I can use my weld tool under my modeling menu, Q for weld, because why not? And I want to try to weld that point. And I think it worked. It did. Cool. So now I can right click and do soft interpolation again, and that fixed my Bezier curve. So now I've got a nice little smooth arc. That'll make me happy, I think. So I've got like a couple too many points here in the corners. This sort of freaked out, which is like not the greatest thing to have to deal with now. So let's just try to delete like all of those in the corner, and this corner over here, and we're getting there slowly but surely. We're gonna fix this. So that's like bending down a little bit too much there and there. Let's see if any of these fix. That was it. So I right clicked and I did soft interpolation, which just sort of told these points to chill out a little. They're just getting like a little bit too aggressive with their Bezier points. And I think I've got a couple unnecessary points, in my opinion. Symmetry Object just sort of gave me a little bit more than I bargained for. So I'm just kind of cleaning these up a little bit. And I'm trying to work as like symmetrically as I can, just so that these are going to be shaped identically. Just because I'm kind of picky about that, personally. Yeah. All right. Pretty happy with that. There we go. Cool. So we've got just one spline. As we see, there's not a whole lot to it. So I'm going to name this leg spline. And that looks cool from this perspective, but from this perspective I know that I've got some work ahead of me. It's a little hard to see the spline in this view, so I can go to my viewport settings and I can adjust the transparency of this background image a little bit, just so that I can see the white of my spline path on top of the blinding white light of my image. So I'm just going to move my spline object over. So I'm just going to start at the top and sort of work my way down from there. So those look potentially a little bit too tall. I don't know. The perspective of this photograph is a little off, so I'm not going to trust it like 100%. I'm just going to kind of try to follow my instincts and move some of these points to sort of replicate the fact that this leg bows out a little bit. So I'm selecting my points, kind of pulling out that a little bit, pulling these. Actually, these ones should rotate a little bit that way, I think, which will allow me to pull these ones over. Just follow the sort of natural kind of curvature of this piece a little bit. That didn't work. What went wrong? I think that's good enough. So we've just got a spline, but the spline represents sort of the whole profile of this leg. To actually make some useful geometry out of this, we need two more pieces. We need a basic circle spline, which will be super huge by default, so we can lower its radius. I'm just going to try like 10 and just see what happens. And then we need a sweep object, which is found right here. So I had my spline selected. I'm going to hold down Alt and make the sweep, so that way it parents correctly. And then drag my circle into the mix, and we see that I just made the circle path follow along the pen path that we drew, which creates basically the rough outline of our leg. So if I just zoom in here, there are sort of like extrusions, and it looks like there's a lot of room to get creative with the knife tool. I don't think I really need to go into all that. I'm just going to add the little spots for the feet here. I can probably just do those with some simple cubes, I hope. Fingers crossed. So we're going to call this leg. And it looks like that 10 centimeter radius is a little bit too thick down here, but it's actually pretty appropriate up here where it's sort of thicker, which leaves me in a little bit of a conundrum, kind of. So how can I get around that? Well, as we can see, there is this details panel that has this graph that I've opened up, and I can click that little arrow right there and then click this show in separate window, just to hopefully make this a little bit larger for us on the screen capture. So what this graph right here is saying is it's at the whole length of the graph along the x-axis. It's all the way up on the y-axis, up at 1.0. So it's basically telling the graph or the graph is telling, if I lock that, it's telling us to use that whole 10 centimeter radius of this circle along the whole graph. But we don't need to do that because, or we don't want to do that, because we see here down at the bottom we actually want this to be a little bit thinner. So we can add a couple points to this graph by holding Control and just kind of praying. That was not the button that I wanted. Here we go. So if I, as I'm moving this graph around, keep an eye on what's going on over here in the viewport. It's starting to kind of get thinner and fatter in certain sections. So I'm sort of trying to line up the shape right here, but we notice now it's getting too thin right there. So just like when we're making a gradient kind of in Photoshop, you've used the gradient tool, you can put two knots on your gradient kind of like real close to each other to create this kind of shape. Right, you mean right in the corner? It's not great. We can fix the fact that right here it's pinching a little bit. We can address that in a moment. No, it is not desired. But I think the harder part would be scaling all these portions over here. Just this little corner will be a simpler fix than we might think. So I'm just going to kind of try to guess, figure out where I need to put the rest of these points in. Hello. We're not looking too close right there, but I think I'm going to live for now. This just gives me like a little, kind of a little bit more detail, sort of. Makes it look like I gave it a tiny bit more effort than just plopping two splines together. So that's one leg. Anyone want to guess what the next step would be?
Symmetry.
Yes. So we're just going to do a symmetry, set up the other leg, and then we'll call that a lesson. This will be a little bit on the long side, so apologies. But this is important stuff to learn, and we've got the time to kind of slow down and take our time.
The symmetry on that leg, it bows out the different way.
It should. It should bow out the way that we want to. The trick here is going to be setting up our symmetry object the way that we want to. So if I just solo this leg and I save, let's just make a symmetry object and hold down Alt like we've been trained to do so far in the lesson to make the symmetry object grouped correctly, and we see that is not what we want. That is, the second leg is not over here where it's supposed to be.
So, could you clone?
We kind of made ourselves like a tuning fork, sort of. So we're going to undo that symmetry. And the reason, actually I'm going to redo it. The reason that this is off kilter is because the anchor point of my leg right here, the anchor point's all the way over here. It's not centered at the axis point, at the center of our world. So I want to enable my axis tool, which is the sort of L arrow over here, and I can pull this over and snap it to the center point, and chances are I'm probably just going to delete that symmetry just because I know out of experience it's not going to update the way that I want it to. So I'll just remake it holding Alt. And so now we see the symmetry object is now properly mirrored over to the other side that we wanted it to be. So this is the symmetry for the legs, here's the symmetry for the body. I think that will be good for today.
So you change the symmetry for the body to make the symmetry for the leg, for it to go.
It was just on the
Not
leg.
symmetry, where'd
It
you
was the axis point of the leg
Okay.
sweep.
Okay, gotcha.
You want to think kind of patiently and really stop and think when you're moving anchor points and you're using the symmetry tools, because they can be a little bit hard to kind of figure out why a symmetry object may or may not be working the way that you want it to be. It can be tricky, so if you do something and it doesn't work the way that you thought, try to mess around with the little checkboxes and the settings. If that doesn't work, delete the symmetry object and then sort of rethink your approach. Because it would be very easy to make the symmetry object the first way that I wound up with that crazy tuning fork looking thing, and just be like, dude, I can't even, and then you'd just be stuck. So I think that's a good place to stop, and we will pick up this on Thursday.